So, let me more formally welcome you, to this session this February morning. It's my great pleasure welcoming you to another Global Talk session. And today we have Keith Cherry, who just shared with me that, this is brand new research coming, going far beyond his doctoral research. So I'm really curious to hear from Keith. Just before we start off, let me acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional unceded territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songi and Squamish and Wasanich peoples whose traditional relationship with the land continues to this day. And we will hear a lot about this very issue, about connection to the land, the claims on territory, and the political struggle for, you want to call it the reconciliation, but we will hear about how even these terms are very much contested. It's my great pleasure to introduce Keith Cherry to you. Probably he doesn't need much introduction, and also if you see how many hats he wears. For those of you finishing PhDs, you think, oh, there's no life after finishing a PhD. I think Keith has realized, there's so much to do, and you can see here he is at the same time a graduate student, now postdoctoral fellow. At the center, he is affiliated as a fellow with the Cedar Trees Institute. He is, and probably most importantly at the moment, a Killam postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta. I think it's a 2-year engagement, that allows him to pursue new research endeavors. And he is also an instructor at UVic. You might have heard about his work with the Covida group, his teaching assignments in European studies as well. And also, and that informs his research, he is a community activist who engages with local but also global issues, very much what we are interested at the center. You might also be interested to hear that it was March last year that Keith completed his PhD. I think that was the last event that took place on campus. We were all on site. The late stage of March, or was it even early April, that we could do his oral examination. And before this, Keith came to UVic with an MA in political science and a BA from the University of Ottawa. And you probably have already guessed how passionate and well-informed Keith's research is, trying to understand settler-indigenous relationships. He did a fascinating PhD trying to think through territorial alignments, through issues of pluralism and sovereignty, by relating the Indigenous experience to what we have in terms of multi-level governments in Europe. That's not what we're going to hear today about. That will be more the more recent Wasanich protest. The Wasotan protest. And some of the theoretical implications that we could draw from this particular protest. As you will hear, Keith is as much interested in on-site empirical research as he is in theoretically framing the issue. So, Keith, it's a great pleasure having you here today, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Oliver. I appreciate that very kind introduction, and it's nice to be finally reciprocating one of these global talks to all of you after having enjoyed so many over the years. So thank you all for having me here and joining me today. Like Oliver says, my name's Keith. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm originally from Lanú territories, sometimes called Mi'kmaq territories, but I'm joining today from Lekwungen and Wasanich territories, which are subject to the Douglas Treaties of 1850 and 1852, respectively. So I'd like to acknowledge that those treaties constitute a recognition of ongoing Indigenous jurisdiction on these lands, and that they are also the foundation of settler jurisdiction on these lands. And I'd like to further acknowledge that those treaties have never been honored in practice, and that this leaves the legitimacy of settler authority on these lands in question. And with that said, I will be speaking today about the Wet'suwet'en conflict last winter, and about some of the historical and legal context that helps us to understand that movement, and that helps us to understand what it means to say that reconciliation is dead. And then I'll be trying to situate this political moment in light of the contemporaneous mass mobilizations that were occurring all over the world at this time, and trying to think through to what degree we can understand the Wet'suwet'en conflict as partaking in a larger wave of populist mobilizations, to what degree the concept of populism can help us shed light on events here last winter, and also to what degree events here last winter can help us to better understand populism. We'll let that video set our context for today on the discussion of this slogan, reconciliation is dead. And what I'd like to do is explore a little bit the historical context and legal and political context that make that statement meaningful, and then to try and situate it relative to contemporaneous populist movements, and to explore a little bit what it can tell us about alternative traditions of populism today. So I'm going to start off with a very brief historical overview of the colonial relationship. I wanted to begin by introducing two terms which will help to frame that discussion. This is Jan Allard Tremblay's distinction between pluralist and modernist views of the relationship between competing authorities, in this case of the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian state. And essentially, the pluralist view is a view that sees the state as an actor with no particular claim to authority, that the state is equal with other claimants to authority, equal to Indigenous nations, and must negotiate the terms of that relationship. Whereas the modernist view sees the state as having a special claim to political authority, a higher claim, and sees the state as in the position to accept or reject the claims from other authorities and to determine the boundaries of those claims unilaterally. So we can think of the modernist view as a view of state-managed pluralism, as opposed to a view where the state is a participant in pluralism. And what I want to suggest is that over the course of the colonial relationship, we have moved from a pluralist situation towards a modernist situation. In the early days of contact between settler and Indigenous people, both entities recognized each other as independent authorities, and the terms of the relation were subject to negotiation, not only through treaty, but through a variety of co-decision mechanisms. But as the relationship progresses, we get three important and roughly contemporaneous shifts. The first being that the fall of New France makes Great Britain militarily dominant, not only over its imperial competitors, but also vis-a-vis Indigenous people. At the same time, the colonial economy starts to transition from a fur trade economy, which is heavily dependent on Indigenous cooperation, to an agricultural economy, which is putting settlers and Indigenous people into competition for land. And finally, at the same time, we see a shift in the political organization of the imperial powers themselves as they start to transition from roughly feudal pluralistic empires to something closer to consolidated, centralized modern states. And as a result of these three shifts, you see a reimagination of Indigenous authority as subordinate to and managed unilaterally by the state. And you can see this shift come through in a number of ways, but I'll give just a couple of examples. One being the changing understanding of treaties within settler governments and courts, where all of a sudden treaties are viewed as non-binding on the governments who sign them, and courts are willing to allow governments to violate the terms of their treaties and modify them unilaterally. So we have a shift in the relationship from treaty as a mechanism of negotiation to treaty as a unilateral governance tool on behalf of the settler state. At the same time, you have the creation of the first Indian Act, where the settler governments are now creating band councils, elected band councils, who wield only a statutory authority, whose limits are defined by the Indian Act, by federal legislation. So we have a re-understanding of Indigenous authority not as an independent entity rooted in their own traditional governance, but rather as something that flows from and is managed unilaterally by the state. And so over time, we see the solidification of a modernist view, of a view that allows the state to attempt to manage the relationship unilaterally rather than multilaterally. In reconciliation, the legal discourse of reconciliation, the jurisprudence of reconciliation arises from this view. Canadian courts have recognized that Indigenous societies have existed and continue to exist with their own laws and their own political authority, their own sovereignty even, and has decided that the coexistence of Crown sovereignty and Indigenous sovereignty requires reconciliation. We need legal tools to reconcile these two competing sovereignties. And the way that the courts have done that is through the discourse of Aboriginal rights. Essentially, they subject Crown sovereignty to certain limits and thereby reconcile Indigenous and Crown authorities. But you'll notice that a pervading characteristic of this jurisprudence is that it allows the state to continue to manage the relationship unilaterally. So although we have Aboriginal rights, the existence of those rights, the content of the rights, how they should be applied, and whether or not they can be infringed, it's all determined unilaterally in a settler court without the participation of any Indigenous institutions, without any negotiation. Likewise, even when Indigenous people have a right to be consulted about decisions that affect them or their lands, it is settler courts who will decide who needs to be consulted, how they need to be consulted, and when that bar has been met. And as we've seen time and time again, those consultations will not generally require actually achieving the consent of the Indigenous people in question. So in all these ways, the jurisprudence of reconciliation is a jurisprudential mechanism to allow the courts to reconcile the coexistence of two sovereignties in a way that lets the state manage the relationship unilaterally. This is what we mean when we say reconciliation. We're talking about this particular approach to managing the relationship between Indigenous and settler peoples. The modern treaty process shows some similar characteristics. There's a heavy use of so-called equivalency clauses, that Indigenous jurisdiction will be valid only when it is equivalent to federal or provincial legislation. Paramountcy clauses have a similar effect that recognize Indigenous jurisdiction unless there is a conflict with federal or provincial law, in which case federal or provincial law supersede the First Nations law. There's also an insistence through the modern treaty process that the Charter applies to Indigenous governments and that the actions of those governments are reviewable in Canadian courts. So through all of this, we see that continuing will to realize a sort of state-managed pluralism where the boundaries of Indigenous jurisdiction are determined unilaterally by the state. Now, I'd be remiss in this context not to talk about UNDRIP, especially because a number of my esteemed colleagues, including my postdoctoral supervisor, Josh Nichols, see a real potential in UNDRIP to unsettle current domestic jurisprudence, and I'm afraid I have a respectful difference of opinion with them on this point. But for me, UNDRIP really partakes in and extends the same logic. I mean, the document itself is a product of an international system that does not recognize Indigenous people as members. Indigenous people don't have a formal voting role within the UN. They're just represented through committee structures and side organizations. The signatories of the documents are settler states. They control whether or not to ratify and how to implement UNDRIP into domestic law, again, without any Indigenous participation. And in the end, the conceptual structure of the document as a declaration of rights is that it affirms settler sovereignty and and subjects that sovereignty to certain self-imposed limits. So it's a voluntary commitment on behalf of settler states to treat their Indigenous subjects in certain ways. And in that way, I think UNDRIP continues this wider conceptual structure of allowing settler states to manage their relationship to Indigenous peoples unilaterally. So in response to this, the Indigenous Academy, Indigenous leaders, and Indigenous activists began advocating what's called the turn away, which is essentially a strategy of turning away from the state in the sense of not investing the bulk of your energy into asking the state for recognition, asking the state for rights, asking the state for negotiations, asking the state to recognize Indigenous sovereignty and jurisdiction, but instead to focus our energy on asserting sovereignty and jurisdiction directly without seeking recognition from the state. So this is the broader historical political context in which we can understand the Wet'suwet'en conflict. And I think we can see the Wet'suwet'en conflict as a microcosm for this larger story, in the sense that when settlers first arrived in BC, as they were in a similar position to when they first arrived in the West, they were militarily vulnerable and also dependent on a fur trade economy. But as the relationship progresses and settler dominance continues, settler governments begin asserting jurisdiction over Indigenous lands and bodies without any negotiation, without any treaty. And this is the situation of the Wet'suwet'en. They have never signed a treaty with settler governments. Like many Indigenous people, the Wet'suwet'en took their claim to court, claiming sovereignty and jurisdiction over their lands, but the court refused to hear that case, ruling that they could recognize only Aboriginal rights. The Wet'suwet'en then turned to the modern treaty process and tried to engage in a modern treaty negotiation in '94, but found that that process too was not able to recognize the jurisdictions they were claiming, and so withdrew from that process in 2008. And at the same time, we have a number of pipelines being proposed across Wet'suwet'en territory. And so there is this response which partakes in the turn away, where Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders establish direct authority on their territories and begin asserting their jurisdiction to control those territories without seeking recognition from Canadian courts of government. And the most visible instantiation of this is the Unistoten camp, which is a camp which hereditary leaders established directly in the path of several pipelines at a choke point which pipelines must pass through. And it serves both as a sort of border checkpoint to prevent access to the territory without consent, and also as a space for cultural resurgence, a space that is governed directly by traditional hereditary governance systems rather than by Indian Act and councils, and which asserts that jurisdiction and that law without the recognition of the Canadian state. Now you'll remember both in 2019 and in 2020, the Canadian government sent RCMP to break up this camp and to remove Wet'suwet'en land defenders and their allies from their territory in order to forcibly open up that territory to pipeline construction. So we can understand this as a response to the Wet'suwet'en assertion of sovereignty. This is the Canadian state reasserting its ability to manage the relationship unilaterally and at the point of arrival if need be. And so in response, the Wet'suwet'en put out a call for their supporters around the country to shut down Canada. And we had a winter of railway and port and highway blockades, as well as the occupations of government offices. And those of you who were in Victoria at that time might remember that the BC legislature was occupied for a number of weeks in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en and their cause. So this movement partakes in what Odawi has called tribal disobedience, in the sense that it's characterized by acts of civil disobedience, but which are not merely disobedience to Canadian law, but rather have an element of obedience to hereditary authority. So it's not just a matter of breaking the law, but rather of upholding another law. And these two acts are contemporaneous. One upholds what's good in law and sovereignty precisely by challenging Canadian law and sovereignty. And from these protests, we get a slogan with which I began this talk: reconciliation is dead. And so I think this historical context helps us understand what's meant by the claim that reconciliation is dead. It's not a claim that the relationship between settler and Indigenous people is dead, or that there ought not to be a relationship. Rather, it's a rejection of a particular discourse as enunciated by the courts and government. It's a particular way of managing that relationship unilaterally through Aboriginal rights. So I hope that context helps understand the conflict and the phrase reconciliation is dead. And now I'm interested in trying to situate that in comparison to the broader political moment, because this mobilization here on Turtle Island coexisted with a wave of populist mobilizations across the world. From Hong Kong to Lebanon, there were popular uprisings that shared this sort of anti-elite, anti-institutional, civilly disobedient character. And so I'm interested in to what degree we can understand this struggle as partaking in that larger wave of mobilizations, and in what ways it troubles the popular understanding of those mobilizations. And when we start thinking about populism and pluralism, if you Google, for example, populism and pluralism, you'll see a whole bunch of titles like this. The implication that populism is inherently anti-pluralist. This is the common wisdom in the populist literature. And the common wisdom goes something like this. Populism, at its heart, relies on the discursive binary between elites and the people. And in that way, it's inevitably homogenizing. It presents an image of the people as an undifferentiated group, and in that way tends to normalize the majority and exclude other elements in the population. And it's important to understand the character of this claim. It's not just that populist representations of the people happen to be unrepresentative of the actual diversity that exists in the population. Rather, the existence of diversity actually undercuts the populist claim to authority. The claim populist actors are making is dependent on them speaking for the entire people, and therefore it requires a homogeneous view of the people. And any recognition of diversity becomes a tool which undercuts the populist claim to authority. And so populism is not just exclusionary and homogenizing in an incidental way, but is actually a political ideology which actively seeks to expel difference in order to maintain or construct a homogeneous people that can then ground a populist authority. So the common wisdom is that pluralism and populism are inherently at odds with one another. And from this conception of the people as a homogeneous whole, we see not only an anti-elite tendency, but an anti-institutional tendency, in that traditionally conceived populist movements tend to understand existing institutional structures as tools of a corrupt elite. And to the extent that those structures and norms stand in the way of populist objectives, they're perceived as standing in the way of the will of the people, and therefore illegitimate. And so there's an authoritarian bent to populism in the sense that it considers itself unbound by the traditional norms and structures of a governance system. we can certainly see certain similarities to the Wet'suwet'en conflict in this account of populism. But I think there's also something a little bit different going on here. There's an anti-elite element, to be sure, but there's also a valorization and upholding of the authority of hereditary chiefs in traditional governance systems on their lands. So the anti-elite element is selective. It's anti-certain elites, but not anti-all elites. And likewise, the anti-institutional element is paired with an upholding and a valorization of the institutions of traditional Indigenous governments. So it's a selective anti-institutionalism. It's a form of populism which sees the settler state as colonial and corrupt and not possessing a valid claim on our obedience, but which wants to offer in its place, or alongside it perhaps, a vision of traditional Indigenous authority which does have a legitimate claim on our obedience. So you have something a little bit different going on here. And I don't think we can understand the anti-elite, anti-institutional elements of this mobilization without understanding the alternative forms of authority that are being posited. So there's something constructive about this movement. It's not just anti-institutional, it's alter-institutional in that it's positing an alternative set of institutions rather than simply rejecting what exists. So there's a confluence of pluralism and populism happening here that mainstream accounts of populism struggle to account for. And that's left me wondering whether populism is a useful concept to apply to this movement at all, whether we can understand this mobilization as having a populist character. But when I dug into the literature on populism, I began to discover that this is not the only liminal case, and it's not the only case that's liminal in these precise ways. In fact, there are quite a number of cases that people would otherwise describe as populism, but which defy the expected relationship between populism and pluralism. And this leads me to postulate that there's an alternative tradition of populism that's being overlooked by mainstream accounts. I'll take you through a couple of examples of some of the characteristics that I think this alternative tradition of populism displays. And one of them is the presence of a constructive program, the element of building alternative institutions, as well as refuting dominant institutions. And we see this come out in the literature around the Industrial Areas Federation or the Civil Rights Movement, also the Black Panther Party and their embrace of free breakfast programs, community self-defense leagues, community education programs. There's an element of Black Panther populism, which is irreducibly constructive. It's about the positing of alternative sites of governance. And our own Pablo Uzel, who has done work on this in 15M in Spain, has been hugely influential in my own thinking of this. His work looks at the use of public square occupations, which involve public assemblies as decision-making forums, as an alternative site of democracy, posited alongside and against the Spanish state. So the Wet'suwet'en conflict is not unique in this regard, in that it's selectively anti-institutional. There's a broader tradition of sort of alter-institutional populism which exists. And this alternative tradition is significantly different from the contemporary account of populism, particularly in its understanding of the people. Because rather than positing a homogenized view of the people, it's positing a intersectionally disaggregated view of the people. And this flows in part from an intersectionally disaggregated view of the elite institutions which are taken to oppress the people. There's an understanding of oppression as comprised of a variety of interlocking systems, such that attacking any one system of oppression necessarily involves attacking all systems of oppression because they are mutually supporting. And so this gives us a populist imagining of the people as differentially affected by differential forms of oppression, and therefore requiring different alter-institutional responses. You saw this come out in the Wet'suwet'en conflict in the concept that all peoples are victims of colonialism, not just Indigenous, but settler as well, in distinct and differential ways. And therefore, all people have a stake, a shared liberation to be had in resisting colonialism. So once again, we see that these elements of the Wet'suwet'en conflict, this disaggregation of the people into a variety of nations and positions, is not unique, but is actually shared in common with a wide variety of movements. And finally, all of these movements seem to share a certain understanding of political authority as participatory rather than representative. And this fundamentally changes the common populist narrative as well, because as we traditionally understand populism, especially right-wing populism, it functions through a kind of symbolic substitution of a single leader for the people, where a single leader is a symbolic stand-in representative in the symbolic sense of the people. And that leader is expected to wield power unconditionally because they wield power on behalf of the people. What we see in this alternative tradition is not a use of a representative stand-in for the people, but an actual direct rule by the actual people themselves on a day-to-day basis. So whereas a traditional or right-wing populism is necessarily homogenizing in the sense that it represents the people in the figure of a single person, this tradition of populism is necessarily disaggregated and intersectional because it actually involves the people themselves in all of their diversity. So between all these traditions, I'm positing that there's an alternative tradition of populism. I'm still struggling with the right language to put to this, but a constructive populism or an alter-institutional populism, which shares an intersectionally disaggregated view of the people, which focuses primarily on building alternative institutional structures alongside or instead of seizing or influencing state structures, and which has a decentralized and participatory vision of governance. Another piece I've incompletely theorized is that it seems like each of these movements has a connection to nonviolent contestation and practices of non-cooperation as a set of tactics. And what I want to argue is that this tradition of populism is not only compatible with pluralism in ways that traditional conceptions of populism are not, but it's actually necessarily pluralist. And to the extent that this tradition involves building multiple decentralized alternative institutions, it also necessarily entails constructing relationships between those institutions. So this is a populist strategy which cannot help but have an account of pluralism. It requires one in order to realize its populist vision. So for me, engagement with the Wet'suwet'en conflict and trying to think through it in a populist lens draws attention to the fact that this alternative tradition of populism exists and exceeds traditional accounts of populism, and I think gives us a much more ambitious and potentially transformative version of left populism, a vision that's quite different from Chantal Mouffe's description of left populism, for example, where Mouffe's populism sees left populism almost as a mirror image of right populism. It's a use of discursive binaries in order to secure electoral victories. And for Mouffe, you see almost a contest between right and left populisms to define the line between elites and people in different places for electoral advantage. But this tradition is not primarily a discursive strategy for electoral victories. It's primarily almost an anarchist strategy. It's about directly creating alternative institutions on the ground in the place of state structures, rather than or alongside strategies to influence the state. So it's a far more ambitious and far more transformative tradition of populism. And this account of populism, this tradition of populism, like I say, necessarily involves the construction of pluralistic relationships between alternative institutions, and necessarily involves a form of pluralism which is consistent with the broader ethos of alternative institutional populism. So Pablo, for example, has done some great work on the Spanish case, looking at how 15M engages with Podemos and with the Spanish state and with other actors in its milieu, and how it engages with them in a distinctly 15M way, in a way that realizes 15M's internal conceptions of democratic praxis. And likewise, I want to argue that there is a form of pluralism being developed in these movements, which is not only required by the populist account, but which is populist in character, which is consistent with the broader populist ethos from which it springs. And this is really the heart of the postdoctoral work that I'm just beginning. I'm interested in this element of the constructive project. I'm interested in thinking about what sort of pluralism is being constructed between these alternative institutions, and taking the Wet'suwet'en case in particular, what sort of relationship is being constructed between the Wet'suwet'en and their supporters across the country. When we have instances like we had here in Victoria, where a community forms to support a solidarity action, like the occupation of a legislature, that community necessarily develops its own forms of decision-making, its own sites of governance as a protest site. And so we have this confluence of different alternative institutions, the institutions of traditional hereditary Wet'suwet'en governance, and also the institutions of grassroots solidarity actions across the country. And I'm interested in how they relate to one another, and in what ways that pluralism differs from the discourse of reconciliation or state-managed pluralism, and to try and take seriously this idea: if reconciliation is dead, this is no longer a viable way to conceive of the relationship between Indigenous and settler peoples. Do the practices that are emerging in these movements provide us with new conceptual tools? Do they help us think about decolonization in ways that move away from a modernist narrative, help us to realize a more pluralist conception of that relationship? So that's what I'll be working on in the coming years, but I'm afraid the conclusions of that research will have to be the subject of another talk, because I'm just in the planning stages. I'm submitting my ethics proposal this week. I'll be doing some interviews with activists who are intimately involved in solidarity movements in support of the Wet'suwet'en, and trying to drill into these questions. But for now, I'll confine myself to two more modest claims, which are that attention to the Wet'suwet'en conflict can help us understand populism better by drawing our attention to the shortcomings of the mainstream understanding of populism, and in particular by drawing our attention to the existence of this alternative tradition which the populism literature struggles to account for. And reciprocally, that understanding that broader tradition of constructive populism can help us to understand that Wet'suwet'en conflict partakes in very distinct ways in a broader political zeitgeist, a broader set of political mobilizations. So much the same way that the Indigenous advocacy of the 60s and 70s partook in and modified in distinct ways the civil rights discourse coming from the United States, or the discourse of third world decolonization. I'm contending that the present wave of Indigenous-led contestation is also partaking in and shaping in distinct ways the present populist zeitgeist. And with that, I'll conclude my talk and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Keith. And we didn't expect, that you already have all your results ready, but it's exciting to be part of, a new project to be launched. And, like you can definitely see the scope of ambition attached to this theoretically, to think through some of those issues. And maybe I should or could have mentioned that you're currently co-editing a volume that is based on, a previous conference on the futures of democracy, thinking through exactly these kind of issues. What are the limitations of liberal democracy? Where can we push it to make things more responsive, democratic? And clearly with certain people's claims, provide great lens, through thinking through exactly these kind of issues and the limitations that we have in contemporary forms of democracy. But, maybe I'll open up here and invite questions in. Who would like to start us off? Here we go. Andrew, do you want to come in? And then Michael?
Thanks, Oliver. That was really, really, really interesting. Thank you very much, Keith. As I was listening to it, and as you were sort of trying to utilize the concept of popular participatory populism, what was coming into my mind, and I have no sort of hard and fast thoughts on this. I'm just sort of throwing this idea out for you to explore yourself. But two things, it's a lot of the characteristics that you were talking about, I felt were highly resonant with two other types of traditions. And one was anarchism, and the other one was utopian thought. Because, I mean, there's so much literature that I know that I've read about different manifestations of utopian concepts and ideas that just resonated as I was listening to what you were talking about. So it's just a suggestion about going to the literature on both anarchism and utopian thought to sort of flesh out your thoughts in terms of what you're meaning by a sort of left populism. And I suppose that if I have a question, it's does the type of left populism that you're theorizing and perhaps seeing in evidence, is it necessarily, do you think, only functional at a local or small scale level? And if so, what implications might that have for the ability to effectively realize it?
I really appreciate both those questions. And indeed, there are really strong lived connections between both anarchist literatures and the Indigenous resistance literature, and also between anarchist communities and these resistance struggles. So it's definitely something that you do see in practice. The exact nature of that affinity is something which is only discussed, as is suitable for any academic conversation, but I do think there are strong resonances there, both in theory and in practice. And that is definitely something I'm interested in exploring more. And as to the question of scale, this is a question that I actually get fairly often. And for me, I guess, it's a question of what we choose to naturalize. I think for a lot of us, the state has become so naturalized in our environment that we think the state is the scale of governance. Is it possible to make it democratic? And if the answer is not really, then we wind up with a not really democratic state. And for me, I guess, I want to take democracy as the given rather than the state as the given, and say, at what scale is democracy possible? And then that's the scale at which we should govern ourselves. So in my mind, that does require much smaller scale communities, and not necessarily just smaller scale geographic communities, potentially functional communities, which govern particular activities over large areas of territory, but only discrete activities. So there are different ways of scaling down governance systems such that they're amenable to direct participatory control. And there are also some really interesting traditions confederating small, either geographic or functionalist institutions together in kind of concentric circles of competitive representation, which are still directly participatory. And so I think between those solutions, it's possible to realize governance over complex tasks in a decentralized way. And I think you can see examples of that across the world where people are able to govern complex communities in decentralized ways. The Kurdish organization in Rojava is maybe a contemporary example of it. Explicitly anarchist-inspired structure of social organization, which is able to make water come out of the pipes and provide defense and resolve disputes, all of the things that we expect of states, but in a decentralized and confederated manner. So that's where I see this tradition of populism going.
Thank you, Keith. Michael, you're next.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for that excellent talk. I learned a lot from it. I really appreciated some of the unexpected twists and turns that it took. I think it's super important, and what you're talking about is one of the most pressing sort of social issues of our time. It's the question of organization. And I appreciate also that you were speaking about still struggling with the language to pin down what kind of concepts you're using for this. And I want to push back just a little bit and suggest that maybe populist is not the word that you're looking for. And maybe if we go more to the root, the word popular. And I wonder what you would think about the concept of popular politics. Of course, not popular in the sense of well-liked or popular entertainment, right? Popular as in of the people or of the populace, by the populace, for the populace, popular politics, popular struggle, popular resistance. And I think a lot of that horizontal decentralized politics that you're looking at is popular and lacking that populist connection where it kind of takes on this pyramidal or triangular shape with that connection to elites or state institutions or parties. And I think what's going on with the Wet'suwet'en movement and 15M and Gandhi is kind of a lobbing off of the top of that pyramid, or even really everything above the base, leaving you with just the popular politics. And there's kind of a nascent literature emerging on the use of the term popular politics to capture transgressive politics, politics on the street that is not sort of conforming to all the conventional institutions. And so I guess that's my question, is what if you've looked into, if you've questioned whether a populist is the best label for this, if you've looked into popular, and just very quickly in regards to Andrew's question on the question of scalability and scaling up of participatory organization, you may want to attend my talk next week in this time slot, because I do have a couple of things to say about that idea in the context of civil resistance theory, a little bit of Gandhi as well, but in particular Palestinian popular struggle. So I'll leave it there.
Michael, you're so skillful in pitching your talk. That's pretty good.
I'll be there. Yeah, and I have struggled with whether or not populism is even a useful container for this set of ideas. And I do really like the term popular as an alternative, but I think the value, if there is any, in using the word populist is that it allows you to think of these movements as in some way related to the tradition of right-wing populism, which is authoritarian and anti-democratic and doesn't have this participatory constructive element. So I think the question of whether or not it's useful to use the term populism kind of turns on the prior question of whether or not it's useful to try and think these things together as participating in something shared. And I'm a little bit torn on that count, because conceptually, I think you can make a very strong case that these are just distinct political projects and there's no particular analytical value in trying to force them into one conceptual container. But in practice, we see a confluence of these strategies in time and space, where they seem to be emerging kind of simultaneously from shared conditions. And you see a sort of mutability of support, where there's a segment of the population which is attracted to both right-wing populism and these sorts of popular movements, and whose energy can be pulled in either direction. And we see this sort of competition for the anti-institutional political terrain occurring between left and right, where Bernie voters become Trump voters, and Nigel Farage voters become Jeremy Corbyn voters, and similarly at the level of grassroots mobilizations. There's, in some sense, a shared problematization that people are seeking a solution to, and I think folks are unsure what the alternative is, and to that degree can be pulled in both an authoritarian right populist or a popular mobilization direction. And so I think the value of thinking those terms together is that it allows us to kind of focus in on that common motivation and common support base, and try and think through the similarities and how it's activated. So I'm still not settled on whether this is a useful way to describe this cluster of ideas, but I think insofar as there's a case to be made, that's what it turns out.
If you allow me, I'll take my privilege as the moderator here and have a question. I'm just wondering how far, what the scope and, the ambition of your project is. At one level, and I think, Michael, your question went to this, is to look at, the form of political mobilization, the aspiration of the actors on the ground, how they express political preferences, but also through which kind of means they try to articulate those. So that's at one level to look at, 15M or, what we have Indigenous resurgence here in Canada. But you seem to make an additional claim about this being a restructuring feature of the state, of legal orders, right? Yeah, you at least point to this, and here, that's where probably I come back to Michael's question as well. You point out how populism is characterized by this inherent tendency of anti-pluralist tendencies of a push towards defining the actor in terms of a binary, of homogenizing binary between us versus them, anti-elitist or culturally. I'm just wondering, how do you, your claim that it has to be pluralistic? Maybe could you just expand a bit on this particular point, how you could see this kind of leftist populist protest result in a truly pluralist kind of order. I'm not sure how far what exactly you're looking at here, but this seemed to be contradictory. But that's probably also the fundamental difference between right-wing and left-wing populism that we try to point out here. But yet, structurally, in terms of political mobilization, there is this tendency towards a homogenized version and idea about, the people. And, that seems to be at odds at first, at least with our traditional understanding of pluralism. So if I could just, push you a little bit on there, how you see this link playing out. Keith, we can't hear you. Your answer was great, but we can't hear you. I think your mic didn't work very well. It was a bit on and off. So maybe if you could just either.
Am I here?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, if you could stay close to the mic, that'd be great.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I appreciate the question. And this is something I'm definitely still thinking through. But to draw on the Wet'suwet'en experience, the conception of the people, to the degree that there's one operational in this struggle, is very clearly disaggregated, and not just along settler Indigenous lines, but between different Indigenous communities, different Indigenous nations. And so there's a disaggregation of the people, in fact, on the ground. They're not presented to us as an homogenous, undifferentiated group, and they're not presented to us as having a singular claim on political authority. So we can see this, for example, in the relationship that's being posited to hereditary traditional governance in Indigenous societies. It's not as though this movement is saying, tear down the state and we'll all be subject to Indigenous governments. And this will just be the new monism, right, through which people will assert its self-rule. But rather we have this conception that different portions of the population ought to be able to rule themselves in different ways. And so there's a shared conception of the people as entitled to self-rule, but that's not expressed through a kind of singular claim on a singular authority. It's expressed in a pluralistic way as a claim of each group to be able to determine itself. And I think one of the sets of ideas that I'm starting to wrestle through is what this looks like on the settler side. Because on the Indigenous side, I think we can understand the pluralism kind of readily in the sense that there's a legitimization of traditional governance structures as independent sovereign authorities. And in that sense, it's an attempt to kind of reinsert pluralism into a monist state-dominated environment. But for the settler allies who are engaged in supporting these movements, there's also a sort of direct relationship being posited between those allies and Indigenous communities, a relationship that's unmediated by the state. And so there's a kind of reimagination of settler political community as also being independent of the state and as also possessing characteristics of self-rule and an ability to engage with other sites of self-rule in ways that are unmediated by the state. So it's a kind of a double decentering of the state, if you see what I mean, in a way that facilitates these kind of pluralistic distribution of authority, not just between settlers and Indigenous people, but also within settler society.
Thanks, Keith. Nicole, you're next.
Great. Thanks, Keith. That was very interesting. Oh, I have a very bad echo. Okay, thanks. This kind of continues on what you were just saying, actually, because and relates to something you said early on in the presentation about kind of resurgence over reconciliation. And Chris and I and some of our buddies were having a conversation exactly about this because our friend works for does like coastal management planning for the BC government in Glenroad. And practically speaking, you know, the number, I think there's something like 50 nations on Vancouver Island. And so I like what you just said about we can envision it on the Indigenous side of the pluralism, but what does that mean for the state trying? And so I hear what you're just saying in terms of kind of we need to disaggregate the state perhaps, or I don't know, but you know, from a really practical perspective, if we are talking about, I don't know, ecological management, and like Rosie or Oliver might have something more to say about this, but how do we get there from where we are now, or what needs to happen, you know, in the BC government or in these other state entities that seem, you know, so path dependent on past institutionalization and things like that? I don't know if you have an answer to that.
I don't know if I have an answer, but I have thoughts.
Yeah, okay.
That's the topic for sure. And I feel like in one way, you know, taking seriously Indigenous territories provides one way of disaggregating the state. That if we can begin to realize governance on a way that takes the scale of those territories into account. For instance, through co-decision mechanisms, you could imagine a system where the state is a player consistently across Canada, but never the only player, always in co-decision mechanisms with whatever nation's special territory they're on, such that governance becomes kind of a patchwork of co-decision as you move across the country in a way that takes the jurisdiction of those nations seriously, and that also realizes a smaller scale of decision making, because you'd be moving from the national scale down to these smaller territorial units. So I think that taking those jurisdictions seriously provides us with one means of decentralizing, and to pick up on a thread from earlier, provides a real point of contrast to documents like Untitled, which take Indigenous people as kind of like a global pan-Indigenous group of like a minority rather than a series of nations which have territories and jurisdictions. So I think moving towards really taking seriously the idea of Indigenous nations as territorial entities with particular claims on particular lands can help us to kind of adjust that scale. And I also think, to pick up on one of my answers from earlier, that functionally disaggregating governance can play a role there as well. And we see this starting to happen kind of informally already through co-management agreements, that the state will enter into co-management agreements for either particular geographic areas or particular functions, things like logging or mineral extraction or so on, such that you can have a relatively small set of interests involved by disaggregating according to topic rather than according to geography. Again, I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a set of thoughts at least.
Keith, sorry, Nico. Keith, your answer makes me think, those of you joining us from Europe here on the call, it must be such an interesting but also confusing concept, right? Yeah, how should we think about Indigenous folks in communities here? They're not minorities in the European sense. You've done this transnational perspective, right? Clearly, we don't even have probably a proper language in the European context to think about, and that's how you push our traditional ways of thinking about sovereignty and territorial self-governance and so forth. But clearly, we are at the cusp of doing something that is not, easily compatible with traditional forms of governance, with law, and so that's why clearly you really try to push the agenda here in terms of how we make collective decision making, thinking about sovereignty, self-governance, but in a key and in a conceptual framework that, for those not familiar with Indigenous claims here in Canada, must first sound strange or odd, but I think there is something, and UVic tries to be, in a way, take some leadership also in thinking through the legal requirements, right? Yeah, how do we need to change the broader framework of considering law, entitlements, sovereignty along these lines? So in a way, something that is so local as the conflict that we've seen about pipelines and so in territory could lead to something quite fundamental in terms of thinking about what is self-governance for Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think it's one of the interesting things about this topic is that the kind of set of political arrangements that I'm contemplating and advocating for are, on the one hand, very new and different, but in another sense, very old and traditional, in that before we had modern states, the conception of political sovereignty didn't operate as it did today. They didn't expect one overarching unit to have unilateral control over all functions within a given territory. Even European states, or European communities rather, before the modern state were heavily disaggregated empires with various levels of independent feudal and classical authority, some functionally differentiated, some geographically differentiated, none of whom had kind of exhaustive authority vis-a-vis the other, but were engaged in this kind of constant push and pull. And you start to see this emerge out of some of the literature on the European Union in particular that's pitching back to a pre-state past, like the neo-republican theory that Richard Bellamy is advocating, or there are theories looking at the EU as a classical empire rather than as being akin to a state. And so this disaggregation of functions is in some ways kind of just a dismantling of the consolidation process that's occurred over the last few centuries as the state has crushed competing authorities in order to consolidate its own claim. So there's something very new here, but there's also something very, very traditional. Oh, you're muted, Oliver.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and also thinking, through the limitations of democratic claim making, self-government. I think what Andrew referred to, there's a rich tradition also in the Western legacy, if you look back at the 20th century, of claims that push the limitations that a strict state-ordered form of democratically organized community allows us to do, right? So in this respect, you have various forms of traditions to go back to, right? It will be interesting to see whether in your postdoctoral work you could try to show actually how modern they are again, right? And that could be one way of theorizing this. One would be just to say that we really dramatically need to rethink state structures in terms of stifling also this form of democratic claim making, but we could also go back to showing from a grassroots perspective how some of those also state theory how these issues have come up before. Mehdi, please.
Keith, thank you so much for the presentation. I find the topic really fascinating. I think I have a problem with my connection. I'm going to turn off my camera, so hopefully it's going to be easier to hear me probably. So I was quite interested and fascinated by your take on the notion of civil disobedience, because the way I looked at it traditionally was from that classic perspective. But the way you looked at the way you presented it and the way you talked about it is way more complex, and bringing in different notions of sovereignty, like two sovereignties playing at the same time from Indigenous nations side and from the Canadian government side. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit more in terms of its philosophical or theoretical backgrounds and some of the complexities, because I find the notion quite fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is one of the things I find most fascinating as well. And I think one of the ways that you see it come through most clearly in the discourse, the wetsuiting conflict, is the insistence in self-framing and also interactions with the media of calling people who are undertaking civil disobedience land defenders rather than protesters. There's this pushback that the term protester positions relative to Canadian law as making a claim vis-a-vis Canadian law rather than enacting an Indigenous law, as where the term land defender is meant to signal that there is a sovereignty here which was never legally extinguished and which therefore continues to exist and can be acted on. And so there is this kind of assertion of a counter legality. And you see this in the mobilization of Indigenous law as well as a justifier for this sort of movement. And in questions about the rule of law, which emerged around this time in particular. You remember this was Trudeau's big line at the time, right? And Horgan's as well, that protest is all well and good, but the rule of law must be respected. And Indigenous people were coming back and saying, well, if the rule of law must be respected, international and British law at the time of colonization recognized that you only gain sovereignty through treaty, and you never signed one. So from where does your authority come? There's this counter assertion of legality, right? And you get discourses around whose rule of law is being protected here. It's the rule of a particular set of laws, and as opposed to like the way the government wants to frame it is it's a binary between law and lawlessness. And there's a move discursively to upset that by reframing it as a contest between laws, a contest between legalities, which I think is in part a real reaction to the kind of reconciliation frame, which is premised fundamentally on a denial of Indigenous jurisdiction, of Indigenous legality. To the extent that Indigenous law has force in Canadian courtrooms, it's something that will be articulated by the Canadian court. not by an Indigenous legal institution, right? So there's a fundamental denial of Indigenous jurisdiction that underpins the current approach. And I think both the acts of civil disobedience or tribal disobedience, as the Valley calls it, and also the struggle around how to frame those acts is part of the larger effort to reassert those jurisdictions discursively and on the ground. And I just saw Michael Carpenter wrote in with recommending Robin Kellicatti's book, which is funny because I have that written down in my notes as well, and suggest the same thing. That's some fascinating work on refugees in particular, and the act of crossing borders as an act of civil disobedience, as an act of challenging an unjust law in ways that kind of stretch our conception of civil disobedience, which we normally understand as a claim that only a citizen can make vis-a-vis their government. You now have a claim that that a non-citizen is making vis-a-vis that legal structure, and even arguably that refugee is enacting international law or international agreements within the European Union precisely by violating the national policies. So there's this similar sort of alter legal or alter institutional quality to that transgression.
Great. Let me see. Peter, sorry, there's one more question in the chat. You know, what are your thoughts on the creation viability of ethical spaces for alter-institutional reconciliation to exist? That's from Peter Alson. Do you have any, you know, some of the more difficult questions come last, but, you know, clearly, you know, challenging question. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think in terms of the viability, there are a lot of resources that we can draw, both conceptually and practically, in that there are a variety of co-decision mechanisms that exist around the world which have potential application. One aspect of my own research has been looking at the relationship between national courts in Europe and the European Court of Justice, and the way that they have kind of instantiated an interjudicial dialogue, which isn't exactly a co-decision mechanism, but where they each place limits on one another's claims. I think that this sort of constitutional pluralist arrangement represents a real resource. And of course, it's not just in the West, but Indigenous forms of diplomacy and interrelation are a particularly interesting resource because Indigenous societies were are non-state societies, and so provide a means of interrelation that's fundamentally less centralized and provides a real set of conceptual resources to draw on. So on a purely conceptual level, I think this sort of reimagining is very viable. On a political level, I think there's a certain path dependency to the Canadian state's approach to Indigenous people. We see it building through the jurisprudence of reconciliation and continuing into their interpretation of UNDRIP and their plans to implement UNDRIP. So the prospects for making room for the sort of change I'm advocating for within that jurisprudence or within that structure, I think are extremely limited. But there's a discourse around treaty federalism that's really starting to pick up steam in the last few years of trying to use analogies to federal structures to expand the treaty-making tradition and to use that to bring Indigenous jurisdictions as jurisdictions to the Canadian Federation. And I think that's probably the most viable political strategy for pushing forward these sorts of reforms, to try and emphasize that the foundation of settler authority flows from the treaties, and therefore the treaties have a sort of constitutional federal role to play in the structuring of the country. And Michael Ash has written some really interesting work on this. His book on Being Here to Stay, in particular, makes the case that all Canadians have a stake in an account of their own political authority as justified, as being able to tell themselves a story about their community that's legitimate. And that the only way to do that is by embracing the concept that we're all treaty people. And so I think there's a potential to reclaim the treaty mechanism. that could create some real institutional space for this sort of reimagining of the relationship.
Thank you, Keith. Clearly you've thrown the door wide open conceptually, theoretically, but also in terms of the scope of your potential, empirical work. So, the best of luck for the definitely exciting endeavor, you're embarking on now. So I suppose it will involve some field work as well, from what I hear, interviews with actors on the ground. And so it should be, you're working with Josh on this one. So that, should definitely be something we're going to watch. And hopefully you'll be back presenting actually on the findings and where you want to push this. It's always, I found, the most stimulating exercise to be part of the start of a research, right? And you see the, trying to come up with the right concepts, trying to frame it in a particular way, and then probably a year or two later, you will hear where you will take this, and which aspect you will focus on. Because at the moment, it's fascinatingly open, but also that will be the challenge for you to think then, what is the angle that you will take. But best of luck, Keith, and thank you so much for presenting today.